Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you join us this evening. We're going to give everyone a couple minutes to get into the presentation. Going live on this software is new to us, and we're grateful to have Sean providing the technical support this evening. There's no public chat feature in this program, but there is a Q&A feature. It might show up as a little square box with a question mark in the middle of it. I'd love to hear where folks are from, and I can read out some of the answers. If we've got anyone from out of state, that would be fun to know, or if folks are from northern Arizona or central or southern Arizona, that'd be great to know as well. I'm getting a lot of responses here. Seems like most folks are from northern Arizona. We got some central Arizona folks, Phoenix area, Verde Valley, in between. Got a couple folks from Southern California. Glad to have you here. Welcome, welcome. This is great. My name is Victoria, and I'm with the Coconino National Forest. I'll be moderating the question and answer, the Q&A tonight during Margaret's talk while she presents. We're happy to have you join us today. While we give folks an extra couple minutes to get into the program app, I'd like to share some background information about the talk. Today's program is brought to you by the Kaibab National Forest, the Coconino National Forest, the Flagstaff Area National Monuments, and the Roving Rangers Interpretive Partnership. The National Park Service / U.S. Forest Service Roving Rangers is a unique agreement between the Flagstaff Area National Monuments and the Coconino National Forest to provide interpretive ranger walks and talks in the Flagstaff area each summer. If you'd like to volunteer as an educational park ranger, you can email askaranger, all one word, @gmail.com. We're also grateful, oh my gosh, so grateful for the support of Sean and the Regional Forest Service Office for their advice, guidance, and graphic and tech support. And we'd also like to give a shout out to Flagstaff's Science on Tap community for helping advertise this event and supporting the sciences, including the social sciences, in Flagstaff. When the pandemic started this spring, we were hopeful that by midsummer, the impact would have diminished enough that we could go into campgrounds and present our typical ranger campground programs for crowds. We wanted to be leading hikes for you and meeting you out on the trails as well. Unfortunately, this hasn't really been the case. And while we knew we could take a lot of steps to reduce the risks, we just couldn't stomach the ultimate question, what if a ranger program was the reason somebody got sick? So we sought alternatives. This program is one of these alternatives, and we hope to present more programs in the future. Tonight, we present to you Black History in Your Backyard, and we're thrilled that our pioneering topic for this effort to present online campground programs features the stories of several of the pioneering settlers to our area. The presentation will last about 1 hour and it is being recorded. Hopefully most folks have been able to get into the presentation app by now, so we're going to get started with the feature presentation. I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening, Margaret Hengen, forest archaeologist. Ms. Hengen, originally from Claremont, California, has been an archaeologist for 31 years, earning her bachelor's degree from Pitzer College and her master's degree from CSU Bakersfield. She has worked for the public good on the Kaibab National Forest for the last 12 years. She aids the Williams Historic Photo Project Gateway to Williams History. We are thrilled to offer this public, online, broadly accessible presentation. During the program, you can use the question and answer function to ask a question. We will answer any clarifying questions at appropriate times during the presentation and answer overall questions at the end. Margaret, we are thrilled to hear from you this evening. It's all yours.
Well, thank you. Hold on, I'm getting used to this technology. Can you see my presentation? Victoria or Sean?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and thank you very much for your interest in this topic. Just a little background. I kind of fell into this topic. I'm originally from Southern California, if you haven't figured out, and so Arizona and Arizona history is actually still very new to me. I was asked by the Grand Canyon National Park volunteer backcountry ranger group to come in and do a talk. It was February on Black history in the Grand Canyon. And honestly, when I agreed to do it, which was several months before I was supposed to do it, I said yes, really having no idea what it was I was walking into. I knew that there was history. What I didn't know is how much, and I didn't know any more of the details about the Black experience in the West, or much Black history in Arizona. So this has really kind of grown into an interesting topic, and one that I'm continually building on. Tonight, this is really a packed one, so I'm going to probably move through this pretty quickly because, unfortunately, as I was getting ready for this evening, I probably got a little over ambitious. But I hope everyone will find something in here that's really interesting. And the key from my approach to this was, please bear in mind, I'm an archaeologist, not a historian. So my approach to this history is not one of a historian, but more in terms of looking at the Black experience in the West and looking at what brought Black people to Arizona and what were their lives like here in Arizona. So the focus of this talk is really looking at some of the mechanisms that brought Black people to Arizona and what they did here, the aspects of Arizona history that they participated in, and how they gave to and were a part of the history here that oftentimes it's overlooked and certainly not necessarily recorded in a way because these people who are coming oftentimes are laborers and they're service industry folks. There are people who are coming here to work and be part of the economic system here in Arizona, and those are the folks who are not always recorded. With that said, I will go ahead and get started with this presentation. Let's see. When you think of, and although I obviously misspelled Columbus, when you think of Black history in the Southwest, what a lot of people don't understand is that African descended people came to the Southwest with the first Spanish. Spain and Portugal had a long history and economic and cultural relationships with Western and Northern Africa long before the Americas were ever discovered. So when Columbus came to North America, stumbled upon North America, he actually brought with him people of African descent. So the first, really, truly the first Africans landed on this continent at the same time as the Spanish. So this list kind of gives you an idea of how the people who came, some were both African descent, what they call mestizos or mixed African descent. Some were freed people, some were slaves. As you can see, really, you had a mix of people coming in as part of the Spanish, and you get this ancestry that develops in the Southwest of a mix of people of African descent, Spanish descent, and eventually Native American descent. They're essentially starting these communities in New Mexico, Arizona, California, Los Angeles, San Diego, Tucson, Santa Fe, all these early Spanish communities that are starting here in the Southwest that actually have quite a few people of African descent. So the first slaves, as we know of slavery in North America, are really coming in with the Dutch on the 1619. In the 1619, those who are familiar with the 1619 project, and that's what they're really referring to, is the Dutch bringing in these slaves as part of that slave trade. But when in fact already here in the Southwest, there were and had been for several hundred years people of African descent. So some of the more well-known Spanish Africans, for those, especially for those of us in California who are familiar with some of these folks, like this gentleman up on the right-hand side, this is Pio Pico. There are places named in Los Angeles after him. He was of African descent. He actually was a Don. He had land. He was well known, and he actually was the governor and was the only Black governor of California twice prior to before California was a state. Esteban, who was a slave, many people know of him. Esteban means Stephen. He actually came with one of the early Spanish. They landed in Florida and actually got lost in Florida for a few years and eventually made their way out of Florida and to Sinaloa, Mexico. And it was in Sinaloa, Mexico that they started north looking for Cibola, the 7 cities of gold. Apparently, according to lore, he didn't make it up as far as almost to Hopi. Or what today is Hopi, and it's believed that he was killed somewhere around Zuni Pueblo, and I suspect there's some interesting stories around there that would be good to talk with the tribes about. But as I said, the early Spanish communities did have a lot of folks of African descent and people who we today would call Afro-Latinos. But as we moved into the history and as Americans come to this part of the continent, a lot of that history and a lot of those people are basically disenfranchised. So by the Mexican-American War in 1848 and 1849 and the Gadsden Purchase by 1854, you have a lot more Americans coming into the area, and those folks of African descent who've kind of melted into the communities that were here already, they essentially are not counted as Americans, and their culture as Afro-Latinos is essentially lost. Other African Americans who can make it over to the West very early on include explorers such as James Beckwourth, who was a mountain man. Mountain men were, Black mountain men were actually fairly common in the West, it seems. They were thought to have a great ear for Indian languages. Another famous one would be York, who was a slave who came with Lewis and Clark. He too, apparently the Blackfeet certainly knew who he was, and I believe Mandan did. Another part of the West that people don't know is that when the Mormons came to Utah, a lot of Mormons, not all, but many of the Mormons actually came out of the South. They were slave owners. So when they came to Utah, they brought with them slaves. So Biddy Mason here on the left-hand side, she was a slave to a Mormon family who had lands in California. She was taken from Utah to California realized that when California came into the Union, it came in as a free state. So slavery was not legal in California. She finally realized that. She and several other slaves who were brought by this gentleman, and she actually sued and won her freedom. She actually bought land in what is now downtown Los Angeles and became wealthy and was known as quite the entrepreneur and philanthropist. And then Amen and Samuel Chambers here were in fact Mormons themselves and were part of the Mormon community in Utah. So when you have the Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation, that's when you start seeing a lot more African Americans making their way to the West. One of the things that's really key about the Emancipation Proclamation, which a lot of people don't understand, is that the Emancipation Proclamation actually only freed American Black slaves. Slaves that were Black people were enslaved to tribal people, many of which had been moved to Oklahoma by this point on the Trail of Tears and other mass migrations, forced migrations. They took their slaves with them. And the slaves actually were not free for another 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. So when talking about the Civil War, and most people are aware that when the Emancipation came in the South, there was a period called Reclamation, and I won't go into that. I think the key is when the Reclamation period started to wane, Jim Crow laws started to come in. So some folks are familiar with these and some are not. These Jim Crow laws are primarily a product of the South, whereas in the West, you get more of what is known as systemic racism. This is really something that's in the news right now, and you need to understand the difference between the two. And I love this little cartoon here on the left-hand side. It shows my age, but the key here is understanding that, this is an elf, and the elves don't do dentistry. All they can do is make toys. So basically, Black people came to the West and they were accepted in the West as long as they stayed within their social norms and within the economic systems they were accepted in. So when you compare systemic racism versus Jim Crow, which is primarily a Southern outcrop from slavery, both of them function very similarly. They both function to oppress and disenfranchise all people of color. Bear in mind, the biggest population of African Americans at this point is in the South. You do have Black people in the West, but nowhere near the same percentages. So out here, what you also are also being disenfranchised are not only Black people, but Chinese, Asian people, Mexican people, and Native American people. So it's a broader thing. Both of these systems are reinforced by cultural norms, laws, and regulations. Jim Crow pretty much is really about its continuation of slavery and making sure that those systems that were set up in slavery, even though Black people were free, continued on into past reclamation into this period. So there are other systems that were basically like slave labor that continue to build up. So the penal system, where men were put into the penal system and made to work on chain games and sharecropping. These are systems that were set up in the South very much to maintain that kind of oppression. Also, Jim Crow actually deterred Black voters. I'm doing a lot of research on individual Black people in the West, and one of the ways I find them is through their voter records. So Black people in the West are voting, but in the South they're being pressed. And then in here also, in the South, Jim Crow, there's much more violence and much more, the level of violence and terrorism is much higher in the South than what you're finding here in the West. Not that it isn't happening, it is, but nowhere near the extent that you would find in the South. So I hope that helps to define the difference between how these systems work. Both oppressive. Black people of color in the West are actually going through oppression. There's no question about it. But it's a different level and different intensity here. Also, through systems, the other aspects of it that's enforcing it is obviously through housing. Black people are only allowed to live in certain communities. and especially in Phoenix and the big cities in Phoenix and Tucson. Systems like redlining, which is more of an Eastern thing, but they still here in the West that Black people are only allowed to live in specific areas. So that was being controlled. The other part, the aspect of segregation was that the schools here in the West in Arizona were segregated. A lot of the schools in a lot of the states in the West were segregated at this time. There were a lot of Southerners who were moving west, and they were bringing with them a lot of their attitudes around race and segregation. So Arizona did, in fact, it was noticed as in 1909. So they actually enforced school segregation prior to Arizona even becoming a state. What's interesting, that class in the upper right-hand corner, that's actually in Williams, Arizona, prior to the implementation of segregation. You can see it's very much of a mixed race class. Excuse me for my dog barking. But after 1909, you do see that there are separate schools. Tucson, Phoenix, Flagstaff all have separate schools. There's larger Black populations, so they actually can separate students into separate school systems. In Williams, where there are just a handful of Black students, sometimes they're in just separate desks in the same room. In Williams, really the segregation was more about segregating out Mexican students, more so than Black students, simply because of the population. But I noticed that the Dunbar School here in Tucson is actually being refurbished, and there's some great programs associated with that. The Murdoch Center here in Flagstaff and the Washington Carver High School in Phoenix all have been preserving some of this history and other Black history of Phoenix. So please check them out. Are there any questions now before I get more into the history aspect? Anything, Victoria?
We have no clarification questions at this time.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I should have mentioned that, yeah, if you have questions or burning questions you'd like me or to clarify during the presentation, please go ahead and put it in the Q&A, or we will also have a question session at the end. So to take a look at Arizona history, key thing to look at here is that some of the first African Americans were enumerated in 1860. And the key point here is notice this is 21 all free. So what they're really enumerating here are Black Americans and not Black Latinos, because I can guarantee there are quite a few people of Latin, Black, African descent who were already here, but for whatever reason are not being counted as part of these census, as part of the American census. So you can see this major population jump right about 1890, and we'll talk about why that happens. So to get into why African Americans are coming to the West, one of the ways they're coming to the West, like York with Lewis and Clark, African Americans are being brought into the West with some of the early scientific expeditions. These are being funded by government after the Gadsden Purchase in 1857, and these lands start opening up to the West. A real interest in understanding what was here was spurred on many early explorers. So from the Corps of Engineers to Emil Weeks and all those, and they brought with them African American laborers and boatmen and people who were a part of these expeditions. Also, as Arizona started building up, before the trades were brought in the 1880s, and some of the early routes, such as the Bill Wagon Road, just came in the 1850s. And one of the ways to get resources into Arizona was up the Colorado River. And a lot of people don't realize that the Colorado River did in fact run steamboats up to La Paz, and the resources, goods and services, mail, all came through Yuma, mostly out of California, up the Gulf into Yuma. It was transferred onto steamboats. And who were the main steamboat people at that time? Who were running steamboats up and down the Mississippi River, for instance? There were a lot of African Americans who were coming in and being laborers on these steamboats. And so they were running the goods and services at the La Paz. A lot of this material was going over to Jerome, which was just beginning to develop as a mining area. Another thing that brought African Americans to the West was the Homesteading Acts of 1862. This allowed for any person who wanted to and had the wherewithal to come out west and stake a claim and basically improve that area over a period of time, and then register with the government, register the government, improve it. I think they had to do up to about $100 worth of improvements. In those days, that was quite a bit of money. And then would able to actually earn this land. African Americans did take advantage of this opportunity. And in some cases, as you can see in this ad, they were encouraged. There were ads that were put out, and people were encouraged to come out and get involved, become to homestead lands, get involved in burgeoning agriculture or mining or some of the early entrepreneurial activities that were happening throughout the West. So Black people were coming. Here in Williams, there was a woman named Burke, Melinda Burke, and she actually came in 1903 by herself. She was middle-aged by this point, and she came and actually homesteaded land, which is still private, just outside of Williams. She worked in town as a laundress, but she also was able to prove up that land. She actually died in 1910. As I said, she was middle-aged at the time, and her adult son, who was a Buffalo soldier, inherited the land. But this is just one of many stories of these folks who came, and they did, in fact, successfully homestead land. African Americans also used this Homesteading Act as an opportunity to actually develop Black communities. They are otherwise known as freedmen communities. There were quite a few of them in places like Oklahoma and Texas, and where Black people would band together, and they would as a group create a community, basically run for Black people. Blackdom in New Mexico is probably one of the more famous. Mobile in southern Arizona was a community that was encouraged. I think it was around a religious figure. I'm not sure how successful that was. There's also Randolph, Arizona, which actually I don't believe was started as a Black town, but functionally became a Black town because this is where a lot of the agricultural workers of southern Arizona lived. Allensworth in California was also famous for this. Named after Colonel Allensworth, who was with the Buffalo Soldiers. And then Nicodemus in Kansas was also a famous community, which also, by the way, I believe is a national park. So these are strategies that African Americans used to be able to allow to gain land, access to land, but also get access to some economic freedom. Another thing that brought African Americans to Arizona was mining. Interestingly enough, and I didn't realize this until I had read Bernard Wilson's book on the Black residents of Tucson. And he successfully shows that there are many Black people who come into the mining areas, the copper mining areas of the outside of Tucson, so Globe, Miami, and those communities. Where African Americans are coming in, and they're coming in as laborers. They're also coming in to invest in mining. So in the case of Annie Box and Williams Curly Neal, they came in as investors and did very well. I believe they may have been miners themselves. They also were able to make enough money to run a hotel in their own. But they're just an example of other people who came into the area to take advantage of these opportunities to get involved in mining. And I'm sure there are a lot more stories than even Mr. Wilson has been able to uncover in his research. An area that a lot of people think of African Americans is in the ranching cowboy area, especially in the West. And that is in fact very true. In Texas, in Oklahoma, and southern New Mexico. Here in Arizona, particularly in northern Arizona, you're not seeing as much in the way of African Americans in the ranching industry. I do have this exhibit here of Jeffrey Tribbett, and that's a interesting photo for those who may know of the Aztec Cattle Company and the range wars that happened in the Holbrook, Winslow area. According to a book I looked at today, Jeffrey Tribbett moved with the Aztec Cattle Company out of Texas, where there were quite a few black ranchers and black cowboys. What's interesting is we refer to the term cowboys. We refer to the term cowboys. Cowboy, actually, the term cowboy is actually a derogatory term, which a lot of people don't know. The term cowboy is actually referring to men or boys who work cows. So initially, it was attached to black men who worked in the ranching industry in Texas and Oklahoma, and they were referred to as cowboys, whereas Mexican, I assume they were vaqueros, and excuse me, and vaqueros, and then white cowboys, if we call them cowboys now, they were buckaroos. Excuse me, there was a whole different term. I think how Hollywood really helped to make the term cowboy a popular term, and one that kind of took over for men who worked with cattle, etc. So it actually is a derogatory term originally. Ranching itself in the West, another area where you see black men in ranching, is really as cooks. They are brought in and when they do the big cattle drives up through Kansas, black men are often hired as cooks, and this is an area that black men are frequently able to find employment. My apologies for the dog barking. When the railroad came to the West and opened up the West, this brought opportunities for people to come out of the East to the West and get involved in a variety of different economic areas. In northern Arizona, the first railroad, of course, was the Atlantic Pacific, which was later bought out by the Atchison. The railroad here, I don't have a lot of evidence that there were a lot of black people associated with the railroad construction. However, this photo, which just came to light recently, at least to me, thank you folks at Flagstaff District, you do see African Americans here who are part of a construction, dam construction just outside of Flagstaff. But for instance, when they extended the railroad up to the Grand Canyon, most of the workers there were Mexican or Native American. You didn't see black people as part of that construction crew. So I'm not entirely sure how much black people were involved in the railroad construction here in the West. Another big avenue for black people coming out here to the West was through the U.S. colored troops, the Buffalo Soldiers. A lot of people don't understand the Buffalo Soldiers were one of the major forces, military forces here in the West. They made up 1/5 of the U.S. military force. They were born out of the black troops that fought in the Civil War, and in fact, it was Civil War vets that are often part of the first cavalry groups, infantry, and then they brought in younger groups. So these were seasoned veterans who first made up the first Buffalo Soldiers, the first U.S. colored troops. They were stationed all over the West, including California. And their role was varied. And in some ways, they acted basically as a very large police force, helping with very different aspects of the development of the West. In this case, you can see the railroad surveys, telegraph installation. They would when Wells Fargo was running their wagon trains through for their banknotes, etc., they often brought in the Buffalo Soldiers to help protect them. When they went after Geronimo to encourage Geronimo to go back to the reservation, Buffalo Soldiers were a part of that effort. They were stationed in all the forts pretty much here at one point or another in Arizona, and many of them stayed. So what's interesting their duty was done, they would actually stay here in the Southwest. So this that their part of their role was to work with tribal folks, ensure they stayed on the reservations, or help with the effort to push tribal people back on or onto reservations. They also worked with the scouts, such as the Apache, in this case, Navajo scouts here on the left. And in some cases, in Texas, they were, in fact, themselves considered Indians. So the Seminole Indian Scouts of Texas, they were stationed in Brackettville, Texas. They had been moved to Oklahoma and decided they didn't like it in Oklahoma and left and went to Mexico. And basically started a community in Mexico, and then were enticed back north to help with the military efforts along the border, north of the border. So even today, I visited Brackettville, Texas this last December, and there are descendants still living in Brackettville, Texas, but they also have families still in the original communities in Mexico. So they've actually got dual citizenship, even today. Another thing that brought Black people to the West was service industry. And so in this case, for instance, here with Mary Green, she was a domestic. She was brought with her employer, who brought her and her family with them to basically help them with their household when they came to Phoenix. Mr. Wilson talks about in his book on Tucson, it has a whole discussion around Black barbers, again, an economic area where Black men in particular, were accepted. You also had Black waiters, people working in restaurant industries and other types of service industries that Black people were able to actually get into and be very successful in Arizona. And most people don't really realize it, but early on, there was a much larger population of Black men than women, but women were here, no question about it. In fact, and I think I read today, it was in like 1903, the state of Arizona passed a law against miscegenation. There's mixed race marriage in 1903 because there was such a large dearth of both African American and Chinese men, single men at that time. But women were definitely here. They were coming in as domestics. That center photo is actually at Fort Whipple. I'm sorry, Fort Verde at Prescott, and that's who probably worked at the fort doing some sort of domestic laundry work. Women were coming in as prostitutes, and in the West, prostitution was very much accepted here, and there were Black women who were part of that system. There was actually a woman called the Cuban Queen in Jerome, who I believe was of African American descent, and she actually was a madam. And there's rumors, I haven't been able to trace them down, of other Black madams in the West. So there are a variety of different levels in which Black women participate here, and so, we can't discount that they were very much part of this history. All right, so we get into the census again, and I didn't point out that when that time period when that jump in population right about 1880 actually was due to the increase, to the population of the U.S. The Buffalo Soldiers coming to Arizona, that they came in such a large force that you did see a large increase in the census. So by 1910 and into the 1930s, you see again this movement of population of African Americans coming in, take advantage of economic opportunities. One of the things that drove them was, and people don't realize, is that as part of that early migration out of the South, a lot of it in response to the Jim Crow laws and the horror of living through that, a lot of people left the South, those who were able, and most people know of them and know of it as the diaspora and moving north. to the factories and large cities in northern part of the state. When they actually, or northern part of the country, they actually did in fact move west. And Arizona, interestingly enough, was a major destination and for a variety of different industries, which I'm going to talk about. But as you can see by this map, granted, the populations of African Americans moving west were not nearly as large as they're going north, but we definitely were seeing African American migration here into Arizona. A couple of things to talk about. There is the migration itself. For Black people traveling, it's very difficult. Railroads were segregated in the South, but once they left the South, they were integrated. But people, movement along major roads was difficult because you had communities that were known as sunset towns. Basically, if you were Black, you were not allowed to remain within the boundary of those communities after sunset, hence the term sunset town. Also, there was a real lack of services for people, for Black people. So when they came to a community like Phoenix or Tucson, they basically hopefully they had talked to people who were here already and had already figured out where they could go, who they probably had family here, or they took advantage of the various different benevolent societies that would have been established here through like the Masons and Elks, and they would have used those resources, those community resources, as a way to figure out where they could find housing and work and all those types of things. So, but again, here in the West, not as, because of Jim Crow laws are not nearly as destructive as they are in the South. This quote, if you saw the article, I just love it, where he talks about being able to come here to the West and being paid as much, obviously dealing with some levels of segregation, but as he says, at least he wasn't going to get lynched. So some of you are probably familiar with the travel guide called the Green Book, which came out in the 30s. As cars became more and more prevalent and roads became paved, it offered opportunities for Black people who owned cars to be able to go out and travel and see the West. This book was particularly, it wasn't the only guide, but this is the most famous. And it certainly helped African Americans to be able to navigate their travels to the West and especially those who migrated west, to be able to do so in a safe manner. So so as we already talked about the railroad, I'm pointing this out again because the railroad actually was an economic opportunity for Black people. Black porters worked many of the railroad lines coming out of major cities, and we're certainly there's a whole union around Black porters. There's a whole history around Black porters, and they would have been working the railroads that would have come to Arizona and even up into the Grand Canyon when the line was extended in 1900. Another thing that brought people to Arizona, interestingly enough, was the lumber industry. The early lumber companies like Saginaw Manistee here in Arizona and Williams did not hire Black people. They were under the belief that Black people could not handle being in the mountains. They didn't like the cold. They couldn't handle the work. Some lumber companies in Flagstaff, such as Terry, did hire Black people. But what really spurred on the Black migration, and it was a Black migration into the lumber industry, was McNary and the Katy Lumber Company. They were a company out of Louisiana who the lumber industry in the South was dying, and they needed to survive. They have to move their entire company to Arizona, the White Mountains of Arizona. They could not imagine not bringing their Black employees with them. This spurred on an entire migration of both permanent and seasonal workers out of the South, out of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas, coming into work into the timber industry here in Arizona. And Jack Reed, who did his article for the Journal of Arizona, really tapped into the through oral histories, and whole families would come in the 40s and 50s. And some of these families are still here. Some of you may be familiar with Coral Evans, the mayor of Flagstaff. She is a descendant of one of these families that migrated in as part of the lumber industry. The Fred Harvey Company, interestingly enough, they also hired African Americans to be a lot of people in color. And so as they developed restaurants and lines along the railroad, they would actually be an employer. They were also would actually serve African Americans. African Americans who were traveling west who could count on being served. Either if they were on the railroad, they stopped at a Harvey House, or rail station with a Harvey House, they could be served there. If they were traveling by car, they could actually be served at a Harvey House. Another thing that brought people to Arizona was the cotton industry and agriculture. And the cotton industry in Southern Phoenix, some of these big growers would actually go to the South and encourage workers to come to Arizona to help pick cotton, which grew very successfully here. And as it goes back to the town of Randolph, as I said, that actually became a Black community outside near the Casa Grande area. And I'm not sure if there are still Black people there, but this brought a lot of Black people in to basically work in the cotton industry in Southern Arizona. A lot of people don't know that the Civilian Conservation Corps, when it was established in the early 30s, in 1933, was actually an integrated program. They actually brought in both white and Black, what they called them enrollees, and would actually have them in the same camps. And that actually occurred up until 1935, when there was a lot of complaint, a lot of political movement, and they forced Franklin Delano Roosevelt to actually go ahead and push for the segregation of the program. So they instead established what they called color camps, C camps. So they basically moved Black enrollees out of the camps and put them into these segregated camps. But initially it was not. So the first camps in the Grand Canyon actually had Black enrollees as part of the full camp. And getting towards the end here, the last piece and we're talking about traveling and tourism here, that definitely brought Black people to the West, just like it brought other people who are interested in the beauty of the Southwest Grand Canyon. As I said, the Fred Harvey had the concession in the Grand Canyon. They actually hired and served Black people. And which is amazing because really it wasn't really until the 1964 Civil Rights Act where that became mandatory. But here you have a large group of very well-dressed African Americans in front of Bright Angel Lodge in 1956. So it's very early on. So a good example where Black people were interested in participating and being out in these opportunities for public land opportunities like the national park. And something we are still grappling with today, I'm going to just do a plug here for Outdoor Afro, an organization that helps to encourage outdoor use and outdoors for African Americans. It's something that we in Park Service and Forest Service and land managers are working towards, trying to diversify the outdoors and working with organizations like Outdoor Afro that are doing great work to try and bring diversity into the outdoors. So just to wrap up, those are essentially, that is essentially what as I took this little journey to get a better understanding of how African Americans came to Arizona, I'm hoping that this presentation showed that there were a lot of ways that African Americans came and participated in different aspects, different elements of Arizona's history. And my hope is that this presentation helped you to realize that although the population of African Americans here in Arizona was not extremely large, African people of African descent have been here since the beginning. and all participated and played a major role in every aspect of early Arizona and on into Arizona's present and hopefully future. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Margaret. That was awesome and insightful, and I hope folks learned new tidbits or maybe refreshed some knowledge that they had as well. We have one question already in, which is someone's looking for a little bit of a refresher about Arizona's founding and whether it was a free state. And do you know much about that, about like as it was a territory or as it became a state? Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so really the issue of free state versus slave state was basically went away after the Civil War. So any state that became a state prior to 1860, especially in the West, basically the federal government said, well, because that was part of the fight of the Civil War, was whether or not new states coming in would actually continue to continue the slave system. So prior to 1860, a state in the West, any state in the West had a choice of whether or not they wanted to come as a slave state or not. Arizona didn't become a state until 1912. So even though it became a territory, and by 1850s, it was not a state. So people were bringing their slaves to Arizona prior to emancipation. And same in California. California, before it became a state, you had people, the gold mines, Sutter's Mill, and Sierra Nevadas. They started early before California became a state. You had Southerners going to the gold fields, and they were bringing their slaves with them. So there were, in fact, slaves in California before California became a state and came into the Union as a free state. I hope that answered the question.
It did for me, and I hope it did for the question asker as well. Let's see, we are taking questions right now, so please go ahead and submit them in the Q&A.
And I know there's a lot of information. I went through it very quickly. I apologize for that.
Oh, I think you did a good job. And most importantly, the internet did a good job.
And my dog barking, I apologize for that as well.
It's a good dose of realism. We actually have Margaret in Williams, Victoria in Flagstaff, and Sean in Albuquerque as your team hosting this evening. So all from our homes. We do have a question that came in about sort of a lot of these examples are settlers that maybe joined the native communities that were already here. So first of all, just an acknowledgement that these lands were all inhabited by ancestral peoples and still are in many ways. And do you have any sort of insight on maybe how the Black settlers may have interacted with the native communities at all?
I do not, and only because that's an area I haven't really looked at too much. I do know, as I pointed out, that the Buffalo Soldiers, U.S. colored troops, they were frequently used to, as I said, as large police to police tribal people here in the West. So that relationship was a little difficult, needless to say. In terms of settlers coming in and homesteading and how much interaction they may or may not have had with tribal communities, I honestly do not know, and I think that's a great area of research that needs to be done.
Neat. Hopefully that'll inspire the person who asked the question.
I see. I'm seeing something in Victoria. So there's a question about artifacts associated with African American populations. Am I ahead of you there?
I see it. Please go for it.
Yeah, and that's a really, as an archaeologist, that's actually part of that's difficult. And part of this, because by the time you get to Arizona, by the time Black people get to Arizona, at least Black Americans get to Arizona, they are pretty much enculturated into Western culture. So teasing out specific products or specific items that identify them as African Americans is really difficult. So say if you were Chinese, for instance, Chinese have a very strong food culture, which you automatically, when you come across sites that are associated with Chinese laborers, it's very, very evident. Even with Hispanic people, in some cases, you can determine based on the products in the trash. With African Americans, it's a little tough because and also the other piece of this is where are you getting your products? Well, you're buying them at the local stores or whatever's available. So it's very difficult to be able to identify things that distinctly say this is part of African American culture. I know there's some evidence of this distinction in the South, in slave communities, but out here in West, I haven't yet found it. Let's see.
Thank you. Do you see that next one? How pervasive were Jim Crow laws in cities such as Flagstaff, Tucson, Yuma, and others?
I would say a lot of it wasn't so much laws as it was culture and norms. As I said, the schools were segregated and living quarters were segregated. So for instance, in Flagstaff, despite the fact that a lot of Black people were working in a lot of the lumber yards, Black people could only live in specific areas. Flagstaff, that was south of the railroad, in an area they call the South Side, which is, by the way, very popular right now and gentrifying. And same with Tucson. I do know, and I don't know Tucson as well, but I do know around where the Dunbar School is, that actually was the center of a Black population. Same with Phoenix had a specific area where Black people lived, and Yuma. And it really wasn't until 1965, the Fair Housing Act, when Black people were really allowed to live anywhere they wanted to. So really, this is Black communities in all these areas were fairly common. I hope that answered that question. I don't know whether the program's going to be on YouTube. Do you know?
For those
where
of
are we
you
going to post that?
For those of you that are interested in a recording of this presentation, either to watch it again or to share it with friends or family or coworkers, we have been recording it and it will be uploaded. We're still trying to figure out where the best place is to host it. So maybe it'll be on YouTube, or it might even make it to the Coconino or Kaibab National Forest websites. If you would like to know where it gets posted, we will add that to the Facebook event page after the event. If you want to get an email to be sure to be notified, you can send an email to askaranger, all one word, at gmail.com, and maybe make the subject line something like, tell me where to get the recording, or something very clear like that would be helpful. And we'll be sure to send you an email when it gets up.
Okay.
Well, it looks like we've answered a lot of questions, and it's 8 o'clock on the dot. So to close out, especially if you missed it at the beginning, this program has been brought to you by the Kaibab National Forest, the Coconino National Forest, the Flagstaff Area National Monuments, and the Roving Rangers Interpretive Partnership. And again, that contact email, if you want to get in touch with the Roving Rangers, is askaranger@gmail.com. And we are so grateful. Give some claps, jazz hands, get your dog to bark for Sean from Albuquerque and the Regional
Absolutely.
Forest Service Office for providing tech support this evening. Thank you, finally, to the illustrious Margaret Hangen, expert on the Black history of the area, amazing forest archaeologist, amazing colleague and peer, and Margaret, you're a wonderful presenter as well, and we are so grateful to have spent this time with you this evening. Hope everyone has a great
Thank you.
rest of your evening. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.